Hi, it's Maya here, finally with the second part of my January wrap-up. And so this will be all the books that I read during the second half of January. I took part in the Diverseathon readathon, but I will be going through the other books first, and then I'll go through all the books I read for Diverseathon. So the first book that I finished during the second half of January was Planetfall by Emma Newman, and this is a science fiction book. The main character is Renata Galli, and she's a 3D printer engineer on this human colony on a faraway planet. And the colony has existed for more than 20 years, but there are some secrets behind the time when they first arrived on the Planetfall. And Ren is one of the few people who knows these secrets, and she tries hard to keep the lies behind the colony going, even though it has a personal cost to her. Then a stranger appears to the colony, even though there weren't supposed to be any other humans alive on the planet. I really like this book, but I needed to read it in small parts. The main character has heavy anxiety issues, and when I was reading this, I was feeling a bit anxious myself, so I had to pause on occasion if it got to be a bit too much. I really enjoyed the depictions of the colony life on this planet, how they 3D printed everything, how they recycled their materials, and how they built their houses sustainably. Also, the nearby alien building or alien artifact that the colonists call the God City was really intriguing. Without spoilers, I have to say that some people don't like the final chapter of this book, but I really liked it. The only part that was a bit of a miss for me was a part near the end that felt a bit too actiony compared to the rest of the book. But I gave this one 4 stars. Next I read a comics trade, Saga Volume 6 by Brian K. Vaughan and Fiona Staples. This is of course a science fiction comic, and it continues the story of the main characters and a huge amount of side characters on this widespread space adventure. There are a couple of characters in this series that I love, like Sir Robot, but then there are some that I don't really care about. And the story never really grips me, I'm never that into the story. Some plot twists just bother me, thankfully not in this particular volume. The Saga comics have always been solid 3-star reads for me. I enjoy them while I'm reading them, but I don't love them, and there's always something that ends up bothering me. So I'll continue to read these whenever I happen to get one from the library. Then I read The Blue Sword by Robin McKinley. This is a young adult fantasy novel from the 80s. So the main character is Harry Crew, and she gets kidnapped by the Hillfolk king for reasons unknown even to the king himself. So she learns the ways of the Hillfolk as well as about her own magic and heritage. I probably would have loved this book as a kid, but I found it hard to get into as an adult. I found the writing style dry and an effort to read. I have never read anything from McKinley before, so I don't know if this is her usual writing style. For some reason as a kid it bothered me less if there was dry writing in a fancy adventure. I read it anyways, but now it took me about 100 pages in this a bit more than 200-page novel to get into the story and for things to start happening and for me to become even a little bit interested. There was also some pretty bad POV skipping in between paragraphs. This is something that often bothers me and always confuses me and takes me out of the story. So this might be a book that needs a bit of nostalgia behind it to really work. I gave it 2 stars. Then it was time for Diverseathon, and the first book that I read for Diverseathon I had started before the readathon started, but I continued reading it since it fit the theme, and that was Borderline by Michelle Baker. This is the first in a series of urban fantasy novels that deal with the Fae. The main character is Millie, and she has borderline personality disorder, and she's also paraplegic after a failed suicide attempt that got her kicked out from film school. She gets recruited to this organization that oversees relations and travel between Hollywood and Fairy. And of course her first case turns out to be a lot more complicated than it seemed at first. So this book is own voices as far as the borderline personality disorder, and I felt like it handled this well, even though I didn't know anything about this disorder before I read this book. Millie tends to lash out at people while also feeling very vulnerable herself, and I like this about her. It makes her a complex, not perfect main character. And another thing that I really liked about this book were the Fae, because I'm really into these unpredictable, dangerous Fae characters in books. There was also a thing that was pretty tiring in this book, and that was the main character's ingrained racism. She does acknowledge her prejudices most or some of the time, and she's also later reminded of her family's racism and starts to think about how growing up in that sort of environment affected her worldview. So those parts were pretty tiring to read, but I also did enjoy the adventure and the complexity of the main character and of course the face, so I gave this one 4 stars. Then I finished the Queers Destroy Fantasy special issue of Fantasy magazine. So this is an anthology of fantasy short stories and non-fiction written and edited entirely by queer creators. I started reading this a lot earlier than the readathon. I started this in 2016, but I finished reading the final stories during Diverseathon. So like in most anthologies, some stories I enjoyed more and some less. My favorite was actually the very first short story, which was The Lily and the Horn by Catherine M. Valente. It told about the preparations of a very irregular poisonous feast, and it was written in gorgeous prose like Valente often writes. My favorite reprint from this anthology was The Sea Troll's Daughter by Caitlin R. Kiernan. It's a hero kills the troll story that doesn't follow the well-worn familiar story beats. There were also some non-fiction essays in the anthology that I read, but I didn't really have a favorite of those, and I gave this one 4 stars in all. And the final thing that I started reading during Diverseathon was Ninefox Gambit by Yoon-Ha Lee, and I actually finished this in February, but I will go through it now since it was part of my Diverseathon reads. So this tells of Captain Kel Sherris, and she gets chosen for a difficult mission. She has to retake this fortress that is taken over by heretics. So the heretics are basically these rebels against this empire called the Hexarchate that she serves, and their belief system. So in order to do this, she gets help from a great weapon who happens to be an undead tactician called Shuos Jedao, and she needs to have him implanted into her brain so that he can help her during her mission. And the bad news is that when Jedao was first alive, he went mad and killed 2 armies, one of them being his own. So this was a very intriguing book that caught me with the relationship between Sherris and Jedao and how neither of them can really fully trust the other, and also this sort of mathematical magic system that the Hexarchate uses. And I thought I would have been less interested in this book because it is basically a military science fiction book, but I was still really interested even in the tactics of space battle. I don't know why. I never really pegged myself as a military science fiction reader, but even though I enjoyed the tactics, my favorite bits were still the relationship between the 2 characters and the world building. I have to say that I didn't enjoy the last 100 odd pages nearly as much as I had everything that came before that. There were some POV shifts to follow these random regular soldiers who were taking the fortress, and I would have wanted the focus to stay more strictly on Sherris and Jedao like it had done during most of the book. I think all of this information that we get from the soldiers could have been conveyed through briefings that Sherris gets, or through this correspondence that we occasionally follow in the book between these 2 rebel leaders. Because these soldier characters were so random, reading from their perspective didn't really add anything to me or evoke any bigger feelings in me. It just took me away from the main characters and the main story. But in the end, I gave this one 4 stars, and I'm really looking forward to the second installment in this series. So those were finally all the books that I have read in January. If you have read any of these, let's talk more in the comments, and I will see you later in my next video.